Well, hello, and welcome back to our ongoing Bible studies in the book of Revelation. Um we got into the first vision last time. Seemed to take forever to do an introduction. You'll have to forgive me for that, but we're into the first vision, and this is the story of the seven churches of Asia. And we took quite a while to discuss the church at Ephesus. And I think you began to get the idea that there are a lot of associations that people might make. Uh, if you lived in that time and place, just as I now live in this time and in this place. And if we were to talk about Edmonton, you might talk about the great pride we have in our hockey dynasty here. And we might say something about that, or we might, if we lived in Calgary, where my wife is from, waffle on about how great it is to have the mountains, and that Edmonton is sort of the gateway to the north. But who wants to go north when Calgary is the gateway to Banff and Lake Louise, and and we might even say, behold, you have in Edmonton this false sense of accomplishment because your wonderful Edmonton Oilers won 5 Stanley Cups. Count them, 5 people, 5. All right. However, and Calgary only ever have one. But then you look at the head-to-head record and you realize that over 100 games, head-to-head games between Calgary and Edmonton, the actual tally is Calgary 56, Edmonton 44. And there have been, a decade of never making the playoffs and all sorts of things. And you could spin stories out of that, and you could draw spiritual lessons out of that. You might say you're pretty desperate for sermon topics if you do that. And of course, you'd be right. But if I were to use expressions to an Edmontonian and encourage them to keep their stick on the ice, well, if I was talking to my relatives in England, they'd say, "What on earth are you on about?" Whereas here, if I say keep your stick on the ice, immediately well, that means stay alert and look for the pass. All right. And if I were to say keep your eye on the puck, the first question from my brother and sister in England would be, "What's a puck?" And then I'd have to go into a long explanation. And if I were to mention the great one, they'd say, "Well, what do you mean? Are you talking cricket? Or are you talking soccer?" Questions like that. So we would spin stories, and we have to go back and look at the original context. We have to sit in the pew, if you will, be in the synagogue, along with the residents of Ephesus or Smyrna or Pergamon, and hear the words read to us. And then we would begin to, oh yeah, I get the message, I get the message. Ephesus taught us a few things. Among them was, don't let the struggle for orthodoxy pull you down into legalism and self-righteousness. That was one of the lessons offered. And we have to take that from our reading of the story of Ephesus. If we go further and say today we'll look at Smyrna, and if we have time, Pergamon, what lessons do we take from there? Well, we'll start off by saying that the church at Smyrna would probably teach us the lesson of keeping your eye on the big picture, because we are going to talk about a city that had quite a few experiences that, in their context, we can relate to. Let's start by reminding ourselves that here are the 7 churches, and we are also told that these are the light of the world. And the second of the lamps, if you will, on this particular menorah is Smyrna. And the light is, I believe, being in danger of being snuffed out because of persecution. The church here has known some horrific times of persecution, starting with some of the Jews, starting with the Jews, actually. It leads on through the time of Nero. Because, and of course, eventually the Jews themselves conspire against the Christians to, quote, evict them, cast them from the synagogue, just as Jesus predicted. And once they're out of the synagogue, Christians can no longer sort of be considered a sub-sect of Judaism, and so they don't have the protection that was afforded to the Jews. The Jews had a little bit of wiggle room, all right? So we look and we see that there's some martyrdom that went on in Smyrna. And, well, as was said, over the ages, the blood of the martyrs has been the seed of the church. But, on the other hand, this is a pretty tough time to go through. Smyrna will teach us that the God above had great praise for their endurance. Smyrna is located at the head of the deep arm of the sea. It's an important trading route. This is the harbor at Smyrna. And so, of course, facing west, it's a port. Just like Ephesus, it's a wealthy city because of trade. That trade continues down inland to the river, following the river Hermus. Here's the river valley at Smyrna. It's very fertile. You might wonder then why it speaks of the poverty of the Christians in that area, because there was a lot of wealth around here between agriculture and trade. Coins that have been dug up depict the city with its merchant ships sailing, and of course other archaeological finds. You've seen the restoration of some amazing bits of architecture. Here you have the agora, or the marketplace at Smyrna, and the wealth you can imagine that flows through this impressive marketplace. This city has existed since 1000 BC. But interestingly enough, after flourishing, it went into ruin for about 300 years, from about 600 to 300 BC. And it was revived by Alexander the Great, and sort of he had plans for the city, and it was laid out nicely. You can understand, since this has a history of being vibrant and then going into decay, well, this could well invoke one of the many references that Jesus will bring out. I am the one who was dead, and yet I am alive, and now just as your city was dead, and now it is alive again. We also go on to see that there were quite a few temples. In fact, a little bit up on the hill, there were a number of temples, and it was said that the street around the base of the hill, featuring a number of temples, is like pearls on a necklace. Here's one of the magnificent structures, the concert halls, the theaters, the public libraries. It's even famous for its School of Medicine. And of course, they were very proud of this. And there was a great consideration that this was one of the often considered the first city of Asia in beauty and in size. So that pride would be likened to the pride that we might take today in our city. Well, we live in Edmonton, the capital. We live in Calgary, the more beautiful. And by the way, Calgary's bigger than Edmonton. Well, wait a second. If you count Edmonton's outlying cities, Spruce Grove, Stony Plain, Sherwood Park, Leduc, St. Albert, we have a greater population. Well, so what? And on the arguments could go, especially if you lived in my house and you were married to somebody from Calgary. But I digress. As we proceed into this message, we read, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these things says the first and the last. So, this is the first great message. Jesus is the first and the last. We see this, let's say, in the prophets, especially in let's say, Isaiah or Daniel. Isaiah 44 will refer to the God of heaven as being the Lord of history. I am the beginning, I am the end, I'm the first, I'm the last. I bring about the future, so don't be afraid. I'm in control of the universe. And so you need to have the big picture. Yes, it's dark days for Christians, and yes, it is legitimate that you ask the question, where has God gone in all of this? Where is Jesus now? because things have changed since the days when Paul used to preach, teach, heal the sick, and raise the dead. But you have to sustain your faith in these dark days. And as we say today, it's very difficult to remember the reason you're in the swamp when you are up to your hips in alligators. And it's very difficult to remember when your job is threatened, your family is in chaos, your finances are in distress, that God is the reason that you are experiencing life. He is the reason for the journey. These things, says the one who controls the first and the last, who goes on to say, who was dead and came to life, just like your city was dead and came to life. I rose again. Be reminded of that. And unfortunately, when this city came to life, especially as time went on around 200 BC, it became aligned with Rome. And in establishing the relationship with Rome, it took on the goddess Roma from the worship of the city of Rome. And they became very much cheerleaders for the Roman Empire. There's a famous incident where the citizens of Smyrna, it is said, when hearing of the suffering of Roman soldiers on a distant front, they literally took off their own clothing in a public gesture of support and sent it to the soldiers who were laboring. And they really did like to idolize things Roman. And this easily led on to the worship of the emperor, which I hope you don't mind me establishing is, quote, the mark of the beast. Question, who is the beast? What is the beast? Answer, you go back to the book of Daniel, the beast is the world ruling empire, be it Babylon, be it Persia, be it Greece, be it Rome. And so what was the thing that distinguished the empire? What was the imprint of the empire? And the answer is the cultic worship of the emperor. And we already went into that during our lengthy introduction. When the church at Smyrna receives this letter from John, it's during the time of Domitian, and Domitian had been declared God. You were to worship the God, and the way that you did that was you offered incense once a year. And to offer to a deity other than our Lord and Savior, to declare Caesar is Lord, was anathema. No, Caesar is not Lord. Jesus is Lord. And so you have a very different phenomena here. You have a very different set of stressors that are upon the people. And so the call is to loyalty. And of course, in this time, if you didn't revere the emperor, if you did not give loyalty to the emperor in this sense, then that was a problem. You couldn't join a guild. You couldn't be part of an organization or a fraternal organization or something like that. And so the message, I know your works, I know how you act, I know how you conduct yourself, I know the stress, the tribulation you're in, and I know your deprivation, your poverty. Okay, I know the poverty that you're experiencing. All right, but he says, despite the economic distress, the fact that you can neither buy nor sell unless you have the approval of the government, well, you are rich in the real terms. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Well, there were obviously synagogues that rejected Christ and rejected Christians and had made the break by now. And they said we're the chosen people. To be considered Jews was to be considered the chosen people. And of course the Jews, ethnically and in terms of their religious practice and their very strong communal identity, had contributed much to the city over the years, especially, we are told, to the beautification of the city. And so they were cut a certain slack by the Romans. But when they went against the Christians and said, "Don't count them with us. Focus on them. Give us special consideration because we're ratting out these heretics who we have cast out of the temple." Well, then it becomes pretty obvious that you've turned against the Messiah who was sent to you. And so Jews are hanging Christians out to dry. And this brings on even more intense persecution and stress. And so the encouragement is, they are told, "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you tribulation 10 days." Now, there are those who would like to identify this as a very specific period of tribulation. I was offered that explanation as a youngster when I first read the book of Revelation. Whether it is or not, I don't know. Whether this was a prediction of a certain period of time of intense persecution. However, I will point out to you that the number of 10 is one of those special numbers: 10 fingers, 10 toes, 10 commandments. So it's a nice round figure, and it has a sort of a sense of finality about it. And so, okay, there's going to be persecution, and that persecution is going to be intense. That's what we're learning from that. And so we are told, we are encouraged, "Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." And as we are brought into the resurrection and on into the new heavens and the new earth, what is the crown that we receive? It is not a royal crown, but it is the crown of life that signifies that we have been considered righteous, thank you to the blood of Jesus, and we have been given this victor's crown. And that crown of life was sort of based on the idea that if you ran in the race, Paul will bring this up, we all participate in this marathon of life. And to participate was, first of all, to the honor of the governor of the games, who could be somebody as great as the emperor who sat on that throne, or he could be the governor of the area, he could be the administrator of the area, but you ran the race to the glory of the one who sat on that throne. And to participate and to achieve, well, you were given, in the Olympics, it could be a wreath of ivy, it could be laurel, it could be a crown of green, which was likened now to you and I receiving the crown of life. When it speaks a little bit later of standing before the throne of Jesus and casting our crowns down before his throne, we acknowledge that he's the one who has given us life. So be faithful unto death. Now the opposite of that, you will be given life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. In other words, this is one of the 7 messages that are offered as encouragement to us. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. The concept of overcoming is not that you will conquer and eradicate the world or the persecution or the tribulation. The concept here is you will not yield and you will not be crushed by this, because you have been given the strength from Jesus himself. So, if you stand firm against this and your commitment remains consistent, then even though you perish and you are hurt by the first death, you will not be hurt by the second death. And the second death is when you be eradicated spiritually. You would no longer have an opportunity to come back from death in the resurrection to eternal life, but you would be lost. And so be faithful, and you will receive the crown of life. Well, we got through that fairly quickly. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. And we are concluding Smyrna. So let's move on. Having established the big picture, let's move on to the next one. We can pick up a little more speed now that you get the idea how to read this. Again, let's go back, sit in the synagogue, and realize, well, Ephesus taught us, don't let the struggle for orthodoxy lead to rigidity. Keep your first love. Remember that love is the only ultimate test of a Christian. And in Smyrna, you're my faithful poor in the midst of wealth, persecuted for my sake. Keep the big picture. I'm the one who rules over history. I'm alive, even though I died. And furthermore, I'll make sure you will have life, even though you may suffer physical death. Now, if we go on to Pergamon, or Pergamus, we find this is a little different city. We're going to see that it's located, I beg your pardon, we're going to see that it's located a little bit further inland. Ephesus and Smyrna, both are port cities. Pergamon is located a little bit further inland. As I said, it's Pergamos or Pergamon. Both names are found in translation. Today it's known as Bergama. Apparently it's famous for carpets. In Roman times, it has a population of 200,000 people. That's a nice little city. After you get through with Edmonton and Calgary in my province, you go to cities like Red Deer or Grand Prairie, and you say, well, what's the population there? 50, 60,000? I lived in Red Deer for a while, and 50, 60,000, that was pretty impressive. Well, we're talking, something that's 3 to 4 times bigger than that. So this is a major city. It's established again by the Greeks, and it's very Greek. Alexander was proud of the city. After he died, it became the capital of this little kingdom area, and eventually it was willed to Rome as the capital of this little sub-area. Even though it's in Turkey, it kind of belonged to Greece. Okay. It was, again, wealthy, thank you to agriculture and silver mining. And it's described by Strabo, the geographer, as illustrious. It had a library which apparently had a quarter million books, not a quarter million bucks, quarter million books. So it's also famous for quite a few temples. Had a big temple to Zeus, and he was the principal Greek god, of course. And also, it was the place where the very first temple was built to honor emperors. The first temple was built to honor the divine Augustus, and eventually there were 3 temples dedicated to emperor worship in the area. And again, people were very strongly pressured to make the annual pledge to Caesar. If you didn't make it, it was to risk being accused of high treason. And we need to understand that there was also what I'm going to describe as a sort of the administrative headquarters for the Church of Emperor Worship. And so here, a little bit later, you'll read that Satan has his seat here. False religion. Here's a nice picture of an amphitheater. Here, 2,000 years on, 1,500 years on, after the fall of the Roman Empire, what are you looking at? Something that was very impressive and survives to this day. The Acropolis. Here we have the marketplace. Again, very impressive. And the sacred way that was leading into the marketplace. There's actually a museum in Berlin devoted to the architectural plunderings, I suppose, of Pergamon. You can go there, you can see this magnificent model of the Temple of Zeus, and that's at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And here are some close-ups, beg your pardon. Let's look at the decor, the frieze there from the altar of Zeus, and just, you see the incredible detail and the investment of time and energy that would have been made into glorifying the Greek gods, and then of course the amount of work that went into enforcing emperor worship. Yeah, look at this magnificent detail. Here's another view of the Acropolis with a small theater in the background. Here's the temple of Trajan, one of the emperors as well. And so into this city, Christianity comes, and to the angel of the church in Pergamos write. Well, you could say this is to the pastor, the representative. You could say that this has to do with the ethos, the spirit of the church at Pergamos. And the first message is, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword. Now, the governor of an area, the governor who lived in this city, had the right of the sword. His word alone was good enough to get you executed. And so he didn't need a court. He didn't have to go into legal proceedings. He could say he had the right of the sword, and if he wanted you executed, you died. And so Jesus is saying, look, I too have the right of the sword, the power to judge all mankind, and I also have the power to pronounce life or death. And so I'm going to issue this pronouncement. So once we get our mind around the fact that although the consul, although the governor has power, Jesus is saying, I have more, because I am the way, the truth, and the life. But I also am the one in whom the world will be judged. We then understand that these individuals need encouragement. As he says, I know your works and where you live and where Satan's throne is. And it's pretty obvious now that, well, Satan's throne is the seat from which false religion emanates. And the concilia, or the college, or the church headquarters, the seat of power for emperor worship, for whatever reason, emanated from Pergamon. And so this is pretty obvious that you live right where persecution is going to be the most intense. And if you live in a close-knit society where any declaration of disloyalty is going to be frowned upon, if you are not loyal to the emperor, it's going to be pretty difficult for you. This, I suppose, begs the question, when was the last time either of us made a hard decision for Jesus Christ? When was the last time we experienced a bit of pain or a touch of sacrifice? When do we feel the tension between ourselves and the world? And if there is no tension, the question is, why not? Why don't I feel stress and strain? Here these individuals were under great stress and strain. And the encouragement is offered, you hold fast to my name, and do not deny my faith even in days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. You live among terribly adverse circumstances. And apparently, and this individual Antipas is considered a saint in some traditions. And so the question is, apparently this individual was a martyr. He is celebrated, as I said, in some traditions, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, and so forth. Antipas means for the people, and apparently he is noted as a faithful martyr. The language here is sometimes put this way. The word martys is considered that of a witness in a court of law. In other words, a faithful martyr is one who is a faithful witness, and the name is taking upon it to us. It is saying, well, to be a witness was to die for the truth. Stephen is the first witness who dies, so he is the first martyr. And Jesus is the faithful witness, and he seals his own testimony, his own witness, by death. And if Satan couldn't terrorize these people with death, how could he get to them? Well, the answer seems to be held out to us here. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam. Now, if Satan can't get to us with the terror of death, and then he is left with the weapon of seduction, seduction and deceit, the steady pressure of the call to slowly compromise with the world around you. Apparently, the doctrine of Balaam is a seductive doctrine. Can a tiny little weed burst through a hard surface like a road top? The answer is no. But over time, it can actually spring up. This is why if you neglect your blacktop driveway, you'll see weeds pushing up through it. And Balaam, who we understand from the book of Numbers, book of Deuteronomy, was a prophet for hire. Well, he seduced the people. How did he do that? Well, it says he taught Balak. Okay, he taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. So Balaam said, I can't curse the people, but I'll tell you what, if you really want to undo them, if you want to confuse their relationship with the God of Israel, why don't you send in some prostitutes who serve the fertility gods? So, if you happen to have a God who promotes feasting and partying, all right, and if you happen to invite a few over, word spreads quickly, well then, you can seduce people to what we might call, in modern vernacular, the dark side. And this is exactly what happened with Balaam, and he instructed Balak as to how to get people to be seduced away from the worship of the God of Israel, and that involved feasting and sexual immorality. In other words, appeal to the senses and get people to compromise. And the word is, you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. And the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, in Greek, the word Nicolaitan is the same as, or very similar to the same as the name of Balaam in Hebrew. And so this group of individuals sought to find a way to compromise. How can we take part in the world without embarrassing ourselves? And of course, this is a challenge we face as well. You're called upon to exercise good judgment. One of the areas of judgment might be considered in this time and place some meat offered to idols. And Paul has to say, look, you can call it what you like. You can call it, I suppose, steak Diane, which, by the way, isn't dedicated to the goddess Diana of the Ephesians. But you can call something, steak Diane, or you can call it just plain Jane steak. It's still meat. And so Paul had to clarify for the people of that time and place, look, don't worry where the meat came from. All things are clean. If it's dedicated to some god or another, it doesn't change the molecular composition. It doesn't change the ability of the food to nourish you. Don't worry about it. I know many years ago, there were those who would discuss whether or not you could eat chocolate. Of course you can eat chocolate. Well, what if the chocolate is shaped like an Easter egg, and you believe Easter eggs are in some way horribly pagan? Well, you just put that in your mouth, and it just becomes chocolate. Yeah, but it used to be called Easter chocolate, and those discussions would go round in a circle. And of course, Paul says, look, it doesn't matter if it's dedicated to an idol or not. The idol is nothing in this world. However, there's a little bit difference between that and how you use your body. Your body is given to you in trust. Your body is considered to be the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit. And so Paul has to exhort the Corinthians, don't join your body to a prostitute who is in the service of a demon. And so we wouldn't necessarily reason that way, but that's the way he gets to them and uses their logic on them. And of course, if you have a series of feast days, now we have a calendar, you have this, that, and the other celebration, Mother's Day, Father's Day, July 1st, Canada Day, and so forth. So we have secular days that we, quote, celebrate, unquote. But if these were characterized as excuses to get drunk, if they were cast in the mold of bacchanalia, if they were just chances to indulge the flesh, this would severely impact our perception of God and our responsibility as Christians. And this is what is happening to them. Slowly but steadily, social pressure changes mores, changes values. Back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there would be a certain attitude towards certain behavior that would be considered by most Christians as sinful. But under the onslaught of a popular entertainment, well, slowly but steadily, things become normalized. And once they're normalized, then, well, you just got to cope with it. Now, we do not have permission, I've emphasized this before, to hate people. But we are still called upon to discern and to reject sin. We do not reject sinners, but we do reject sin, so we don't indulge in certain behavior because we believe it is sinful. And so that's as simple as I can put it. And so there are those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which is to say, well, eat, drink, indulge yourself, do whatever you want to do. And God says, no, I didn't create you for that. I did not create your body to be used in many different ways. I didn't create your mind to be polluted by certain things. But, of course, gradually you can be worn down and worked upon if you find yourself in certain situations. So, God hates compromise. It's not because he can't forgive small sins. Rather, he knows that every flood begins with a trickle. Every oak tree begins as a tiny acorn. A slim weed can grow through tough blacktop. He also knows what will cause us to stumble. All right? And so that which causes us to stumble is something that he doesn't want us to be seduced by. And so that's why he says he hates the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. And so if you happen to be finding yourself drifting down the pathway of compromise, repent, he says, or I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. In other words, I have authority over life and death. And just like your governor who has the power of the sword and can speak against you and take your life, I could do the same, and I warn you that eventually judgment is something that belongs to me. And I'm not fooling around. He who has an ear to hear, He who hears these pronouncements, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who resists, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. You resist the compromise of this world. And again, I pose the question, if you don't find a little bit of stress and strain governing your behavior, if you don't find yourself having to make value judgments from time to time, and to refrain from doing certain things from time to time, the question is, why not? Why not? Why don't you sense a certain amount of stress in this ungodly world? Well, if you push back, if you resist, he says, to him who overcomes, and that does not mean conquers the world, but rather resists and doesn't let the world conquer him or her, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. Well, the hidden manna was that which is in the Ark of the Covenant. And so you might say, what did that represent? It meant the bread from heaven. In other words, you participated in the nourishing sustenance that came from heaven. So you push back, you listen to me, and I will give you strength, the hidden manna to eat. And furthermore, he offers this encouragement. I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. The custom was at a posh banquet. Today, if you go to a posh banquet or a wedding reception, what happens? You'll find a nameplate, a card that is placed near a plate, and that is opposite the chair that you are welcome to occupy. They had similar customs at the feasts that were offered, only they would take a white stone, something that pictured, for us, righteousness, and on that stone your name is written, and of course your identity, your name is renewed in Jesus the Christ. You are no longer Bob the sinner, you are now Bob the saint. And so things have changed. And so you're given this invite to the wedding feast. There is also an overtone to this because sometimes to be vindicated, to be accepted, was to receive a white stone. If we use the expression today, if you are voted against or you're rejected, you are said to be blackballed. Well, that's because there were black stones and white stones. The white stone was the sign of acceptance and invitation. The black stone was the vote against you, the sign against you. So this also has overtones of that particular understanding as well. But I think the simplest thing to leave you with is this. You'll be invited to the wedding feast, and your name will be on an invitation, and you will be identified as one who is welcome into the community that is nourished by the very life of Jesus the Christ, who is the bread that came down from heaven, pictured by the manna given to those in the wilderness. So, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. If you've gone through this little story, you picked up a few hints here and there, listen